The topic of my paper is racial and partisan division during Obama's presidency. And I'm also looking at the hope for a post-racial society and the actuality of a society we see today that's far from being post-racial and is instead very racial and racialized. My research question is, why was Obama's presidency thought to have marked the arrival of a post-racial society? And what reasons explain why we are still not in a post-racial society today after his presidency? And what reasons explain the heightened increase in racial and partisan division during his presidency? And to address this question, I look at three possible causes or categories that could explain the division. So I ask, was it the people's response to Obama himself, his policies, or the racialized moments or violence during his term? And my hypothesis, what I believe before starting my research, is that each category has contributed to the racial and partisan division, but just to different extents, which I found after going through everything. So just to spend a minute talking about my approach and method and some of the sources I used, I had to divide my paper into sections, first talking about a post-racial society, and then going on to look at Obama, his policies, and the racialized moments and violence during his term. And I have rings of focus on each kind of category separately, and then I relate it back all to each other into the overall thesis. Use a mix of journal articles and books, some from the class like Post-Racial and Most Racial, and some other books called like White Rage, The Black Presidency, Still House Divided, to name a few. And then my research is kind of qualitative, looking at perceptions and opinions and theories, but also quantitative, is look at surveys and polls and kind of statistical data taken from the public to really judge those opinions. And now I'll just go through and talk about some of my findings in each major component of my paper. So I begin my paper by talking about this concept of being like post-racial, and this idea of being post-racial has been around for decades. Some people believe in we're post-racial after the Voting Rights Act, but really it's reached mainstream audiences, a lot more people during the 2008 presidential primary election, when then Senator Obama announced that he would be running for the highest office in U.S. politics, and then when he won. So just to kind of go over what post-racial means, it signifies a society in which racial differences are really no longer significant, believing that we have moved beyond race and kind of racial separation and unfairness. So many people believe that the election of an African-American person, Obama, to the nation's highest office meant the U.S. could now be post-racial, and kind of proof that race was an indicator of what you could achieve. But on paper, I'm kind of arguing why we are not in a post-racial society. And some race scholars have argued that this kind of assessment of America being post-racial is premature, primarily since just for the reason that the majority of white Americans that voted in the 2008 election voted for the Republican John McCain. So a lot of the country did not even support Obama, so saying that his election into presidency marked post-racial when that doesn't even cover a lot of the people. And something I found interesting in my findings in this section was that not only the election of Obama, but specifically Obama himself, kind of his speech and his ideals, supported this post-racial idea and kind of his vision of a post-racial world. And then this narrative of having a post-racial America is proliferated through kind of colorblind or like racial unity harmony politics and black politicians who function to transcend race. So post-racialism is supported by Obama's racial makeup, being biracial, his campaign and election was based on this politics of hope, and Obama's post-racial and kind of race-neutral rhetoric. And then something I also found important to include into my paper is to talk about the already pre-existing racial climate, just to give some context of the racial and partisan division before Obama and Wade came into as president, to just so I could better test how it may have changed or increased during his candidacy and presidency, and just uses a point of reference to compare how these racial divisions have increased and just the effect on Obama's presidency. And some of the findings for this part in one of the books I looked at was White Rage. It showed how social progress for African Americans was countered with kind of deliberate opposition. For instance, the Civil War and Reconstruction was countered with Black codes and Jim Crow, and the Voting Rights Act was countered with Southern strategy and the war on drugs. So it just helps explain that partisan racial division may have increased during Obama's presidency, but it was already there centuries before him and would affect his presidency. And also the election of a Black man to the presidency is also being countered with this increase in racial and partisan division. And now to move on to kind of the three categories. The first one that we had my paper with was looking at Obama himself and his effect on this racial and partisan division. So Obama himself being a Black man, I found this one important to start with because it really affects the other two categories, his policies and the racialized moments. And just some of the research I found is that in 2008 he lost votes due to his race specifically, and his popular vote was affected by racial prejudice and intolerance because Obama had to pay this racial cost, as it was put in the article, that really prevented kind of a landslide victory in 2008 and making re-election in 2012 very difficult. So just showing he had strong support and strong opposition, but with his opposition being largely due to his race. And kind of the next category I talk about is policies, and I look specifically at his healthcare policy, his 2009 healthcare reform plans, and then in 2010 the Affordable Care Act, or known as Obamacare. And just Obama's association with issues like healthcare polarized public opinion by race and racial attitudes when he became, quote-unquote, the face of the policy. So these racial attitudes had a large impact on healthcare opinions, being an important determinant of specifically white Americans' healthcare opinions. So healthcare policies were much more racialized when attributed to Obama than when the same policies were attached to Bill Clinton's healthcare reform in 1993. So racial attitudes had a significantly greater impact on healthcare opinions when they were framed as part of President Obama's plan, even when similar plans were all represented by previous presidents. And then the racial divide in healthcare opinions was also 20 percentage points greater with Obama than Bill Clinton. And something I found interesting in this section is kind of Obama's response to this debate. So he said that healthcare reform and kind of the hostility towards his policies is not about race, it's about people worried about how government should operate. And he rebutted claims that hostility over his plan was based on race. And liberals and other people on other sides base said that kind of his proposals were a product of this race-based opposition to Black presidents' legislative agenda. So just to show this contrasting positions about the role of racial attitudes on healthcare opinions and on the mass opposition to Obama's healthcare reform proposals. And the article has talked a little about the process of racialization and is how racial attitudes come to influence white opinion about governmental policies, and how racialization issues result from kind of the communication behind the association between African Americans and government policies, such as media linking welfare benefits to Black Americans, such as political messages being able to link racial groups with public policies. And experiments have also shown that Americans' willingness to embrace elite views depends partly on whether the position takers are Black or white, looking at the race, or men or women, looking at gender. For example, in 1993, the gender influenced healthcare opinion because of the policy association with gendered figure Hillary Clinton. So just the spillover of racialization really situates Obama's race and the public's race-based reactions to him as a primary reason why public opinion about healthcare opinions racialized in 2009. And to look at my last category, racialized moments and violence, I specifically looked at the Black Lives Matter movement. So just addressing the issues of police brutality against African Americans, especially the killing of young black men by white police officers, significantly increasing racial tensions during Obama's presidency. And from this police brutality came protests and the social movement of the Black Lives Matter movement. So with the first Black President Obama, the nation was still grappling with race and its legacy of slavery. But really with all of these incidents and this violence, we see that this post-racial society is just really not true and can be applied to America yet, or maybe ever. So, in my research, I really found a lot talking about this contradiction between having an African American family in the White House and how this being like a powerful example of a transformation of racial attitudes and realities in the U.S. And then looking beyond Obama, having Black elected officials, corporate executives, kind of like millionaire socialites and athletes that could seem like a post-racial landscape, and how like the success of a few is being upheld as a testament to the transcendence of a racist past. But then comparing this to police violence and Black people being killed in the supposed moment of colorblindness and the height of Black political power. And something I found interesting in this section of research was that all these things were happening, kind of intersecting at the same time: police brutality and murder, and an unprecedented display of Black political power, and then still a lot of Black people with no real power. And something else interesting is looking, one of the books I was reading looked at the divisions within the Black community, really based on class differences and then the tension between the Black working class and the Black political elite. And then how today various problems that pervade Black communities are largely believed to be the fault of Black people rather than really addressing the systemic and institutional problems. And that the premise that Black inequality is a product of slackening of Black community work ethic and self-sufficiency, and how this has been bolstered by the visibility of Black elite achievement, especially the Obama election. And how there are these periodic ruptures in the U.S. narrative of this triumph for or moving past racism. For example, the Black freedom struggle in the 1960s during the Vietnam War, and which really just exposed the country as deeply racist and resistant to Black equality in this kind of fight for freedom, and just reigniting this national discussion of racial inequality, which was also seen in like the LA riots in '92 and Hurricane Katrina. So in this section, and in the books I'm reading, which I've just been trying to look at how to explain this rise of Black president at the same time of this emergence of this social movement, Black Lives Matter. And in the books I've read to really answer this, they focused on how the reluctance of the Obama administration to address any of the substantive issues facing Black communities, with no attention really being given to issues involving law enforcement and imprisonment, or addressing the effects of structural inequality. And how Black people mobilized historic levels of support for Obama in elections on these promises of hope and change, and really put in context like hope of breaking free from the Bush administration's indifference to Black suffering, which was seen a lot in Hurricane Katrina. And then how Black people under Obama were still kind of feeling or facing this indifference. And just Obama kind of being reluctant to offer or support a Black agenda, really just sticking to kind of moderate politics, and showing the limits of Black presidential power, and not because he couldn't intervene, but more because he decided not to. So just the Black Power movement, or the Black Lives Matter movement, was similar to previous movements, and in response to years of direct and systemic racism, and it raised the raised expectation of Obama and his campaign, and then Obama's silence on critical issues facing Black people, supporting stereotypes about Black culture and irresponsibility. And then later in his second term, we saw more transformation in this rhetoric and discourse of race, crime, and policing, and Obama in a speech terming the criminal injustice system. So in conclusion, for my paper, in terms of further study, I explain more like why we're not post-racial. So maybe more study could look into what it would take to become post-racial and if that's even a possibility. And I also mostly looked at the cause of the racial and partisan division, so maybe look more at the effect of the racial partisan division. And I've touched on some of it by talking about kind of the opposition to policies and social movements, but just to go further in that. And just in all, I believe my paper and findings show and will show that we have been and continue to be a country that is divided, as shown by the racial and partisan division and the increase.